Welcome to Galactic Nova Stories, where cosmic emotions come to life. Your journey begins now. The hum of the ship's engines was the only sound that punctuated the cold silence of space, a distant and steady reminder of the vast, unfathomable isolation outside. A silence that was her constant companion, almost suffocating in its weight. Lyra sat alone in her quarters, the room sterile and stark, an ironic comfort to someone like her. The faint metallic scent of the air recycling system mingled with the artificial glow from the overhead panels, casting soft shadows against the sleek surfaces of the walls. Her form, sleek and fragile in appearance, sat motionless in the corner of the room, her long limbs folded beneath her. Lyra's skin shimmered with an ethereal blue glow, like bioluminescent coral, a reflection of her race's otherworldly beauty. It was something that had once been admired, envied, but now it was just a reminder of everything she had lost. For years, decades even, she had lived in exile, a prisoner not just to her own race's violent history, but to the cruel reality of being feared, shunned, and avoided. She had been exiled to this remote sector of the galaxy, a place where time seemed to stretch endlessly, and loneliness consumed her every thought. Her people, once rulers of vast empires, had now scattered across the stars, their names spoken with a mix of fear and distrust. The isolation was a punishment, but it was also her existence. She had come to accept it, or so she thought. Today was different. It was a moment she hadn't anticipated, a disruption in the monotony. A human had arrived aboard her ship, the first in years. Callan, a technician sent to make necessary repairs. At first it had been a small thing, an encounter during his routine work. She had watched from a distance, curious but hesitant, as he moved through the ship, his eyes always lingering just a little too long whenever he passed by her door. Most would have turned away, ignoring the strange alien who was an enigma wrapped in danger. But Callan, he didn't turn away. Not even once. When he had finally spoken to her, it wasn't out of fear or caution, as most would have. He had spoken to her with a tenderness that felt almost out of place, an unspoken empathy radiating from him. "Are you all right?" he had asked, voice low, as though he had been trying to reach her through the impenetrable walls of her isolation. The question lingered in her mind, echoing even now. "Are you all right?" How could she answer that? Was she ever all right? The truth was, she hadn't been all right for years. The isolation had begun to chip away at her, slowly but surely. It had gnawed at her sense of self, her identity, until she no longer knew who she was without the cold silence of this ship as her constant companion. Her kind, despite their beauty, were cursed to live with the consequences of past conflicts. A history of violence that no amount of time could undo. She was the embodiment of that history, an alien in a strange land, far from her people and forever bound by the sins of her race. But then there was Callan. His presence was an anomaly. He was not like the others. His eyes, when they met hers, didn't hold the usual judgment or fear. They held something softer, something almost kind. And perhaps most importantly, he had looked at her like a person, not a monster, not an artifact of war. But even as his presence stirred something deep within her, Lyra could not bring herself to approach him, could not bear to let anyone else in, not after everything that had happened, after what her kind had done. It was safer this way, better for both of them to keep their distance. Still, the silence of her quarters had become unbearable. A steady ache settled in her chest, a yearning for something she hadn't allowed herself to want for so long. Human connection. The soft touch of another living being, someone who did not view her as a weapon, or a prisoner, or a threat. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door sliding open, unexpected, uninvited. The soft hiss of the mechanism, and then the slight shuffle of boots across the floor. Callan entered, his presence filling the room in a way that felt almost foreign. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He just stood there, taking in the sight of her. There was no fear in his gaze, just an infinite depth of quiet curiosity. His blue eyes seemed to study her with an intensity that made her heart stutter in her chest. It wasn't normal, not like the way others looked at her. He wasn't trying to figure out what made her dangerous. He was trying to figure out who she was. "Are you all right?" he asked again, though this time there was something else in his voice, an unspoken invitation, a request for something deeper. Lyra's throat tightened. She wanted to say no, but the word caught on her tongue, as if the simple acknowledgement of the truth would shatter the walls she'd built around herself. She blinked, drawing a shaky breath, but the answer she could give didn't come. It wouldn't. Instead, she looked down at her hands, the cool, delicate skin glowing faintly in the dim light. There was a sharp pain in her chest, as she wondered how long it had been since someone had touched her, since someone had cared enough to ask such a simple question. "Are you all right?" The silence stretched out between them like an invisible thread, thick and fragile. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, but she couldn't return it. Not yet. Not when she wasn't sure how to let him in. Every great bond starts with a single moment of courage. Galactic Nova Stories is just beginning, and your support matters. If you love emotional sci-fi tales, forbidden connections, and stories that stay with you, hit subscribe. It's free, and it helps us bring more stories from the stars to you. She waited for him to leave. She expected him to walk away, to respect the boundaries she had so carefully erected. But he didn't. His gaze remained steady, unwavering, as if he were waiting for something, for her. Finally, he spoke again, quieter this time. "You don't have to be alone, you know." The words hung in the air, delicate and impossible. She didn't answer, but a part of her, something she hadn't dared acknowledge, yearned to. His presence lingered in the room, in the silence, in the space between them, and for the first time in a long while, Lyra didn't feel so alone. Days passed in quiet uncertainty. Each moment felt like an eternity, stretched thin by the silent tension that hung between them. Callan continued his work on the ship, routine repairs, system diagnostics, maintenance of engines and life support, but with every task there was something deeper he sought, something he could never quite put into words. He had been aboard the ship for nearly a week now, yet every interaction with Lyra felt like an unspoken dance. Each glance, each gesture carried an invisible weight. It was clear to him now, she wasn't just a curiosity. She was a mystery, and mysteries were meant to be unraveled. Lyra, for her part, found herself in a constant state of conflict. The distance between them had remained, but it had become less about her own reluctance and more about something else, a pull. A pull that tugged at her like the gravity wells of distant planets, something that had been dormant in her heart for far too long. It wasn't just Callan's physical presence, his voice, the way he moved through the ship, but the way he looked at her. No human had ever looked at her like that before. He wasn't afraid of her. She could see it in the way he took in her appearance, the shimmering blue of her skin, the graceful sharpness of her features, the long strands of silver white, hair that hung like liquid starlight. He saw the alien, yes, but he didn't recoil from it. There was no immediate reason for this, no clear explanation. He didn't have to engage her, not truly. His task was simple. He could have kept his distance, kept to himself, focused on the machinery. But he didn't. And each time their eyes met, it felt like an invitation. In the evenings, when the work was done, he often lingered outside her door. She could feel his presence in the quiet, his curiosity, his empathy, waiting just on the edge of the threshold. And every time she felt it, it stirred something in her she couldn't name, something dangerous. She could tell it was beginning to affect her, this small flame that was growing, unbidden. One evening she found herself alone in the common area of the ship, her rare moments of solitude that had become more precious with time. The soft hum of the ship's systems was a familiar comfort, but today the silence felt oppressive, like a weight pressing against her chest. She stood by the large viewport, looking out at the stars, her fingers lightly tracing the cool glass. She should be used to this. She had stared at these same stars for years, felt the same distance, the same weight of being far from everything. Yet today the stars seemed distant in a different way. The vastness of space had never felt more empty. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because she had started to think of Callan differently. Maybe it was because she was remembering, once again, the feeling of being seen. She didn't notice the soft footfall behind her until he spoke. "You ever wonder what's out there?" Callan asked, his voice gentle, unassuming. His words weren't an intrusion, they were a soft question, as if he was simply trying to connect. Lyra turned slightly, her gaze lingering on him for a moment before she replied, though her voice was more to herself than to him. "I used to wonder, but now, I don't know if I care." She turned her back to the stars, folding her arms across her chest. "Everything out there reminds me of what I've lost." Callan took a step closer, pausing when he noticed her posture stiffen slightly. He didn't push, but there was a quiet insistence in his presence, as though he were waiting for her to take the first step. "Loss is a strange thing," he said, his voice more thoughtful now. "We hold on to it for so long and then it starts to define us, even when it doesn't have to. Maybe the question is, what are we going to do with it?" His words, simple, yet somehow profound, hung in the air between them. They lingered like the soft scent of a flower opening in the dark. Lyra felt something stir in her chest, a faint flutter, a breath of warmth that was unexpected, foreign. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said quietly, her voice tight, though not with anger. Something else, something like resignation. "I didn't ask to be what I am. I didn't ask for my people's mistakes to be carried on my shoulders." Callan's expression softened, though his gaze never wavered. "And you don't deserve to carry them alone." For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of his words settling between them like a fragile promise. Lyra had never been one to lean on anyone. Not since the first time she had felt the weight of loss so sharply. Her life had been a series of quiet rebellions against that weight, pushing it back, trying to ignore the things that called to her, that begged her to feel something again. But in that moment there was something in Callan's eyes, a quiet understanding that didn't need to be spoken, just felt. It wasn't pity, it wasn't sympathy. It was something she hadn't known she needed until now. She took a small step toward him, just a fraction of movement, but it was enough. Enough for him to reach out, slowly, cautiously. His hand hovered just in front of her, a space between them, and yet in that space, something unsaid passed between them, an understanding. She could feel his warmth, feel the sincerity in his touch, even before it made contact. "Lyra, you're not alone," he whispered, his voice low but steady. "I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time in years, the room didn't feel quite so empty. The days that followed were marked by subtle shifts, small gestures that deepened their connection. Callan was patient, always waiting for Lyra to take the lead, never pushing, but always present. It wasn't the kind of romance she had read about in stories or heard whispered in dreams. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it was real. With every passing day, she felt it more, this bond that was growing between them, untouchable by the harsh realities of their differences, their pasts. One afternoon, as they shared a quiet meal in the mess hall, Callan reached over to pass her a small piece of bread. Their fingers brushed lightly, and for the briefest moment time seemed to stretch. The contact was so simple, yet it felt as though 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. The sensation, warmth, human touch, was more intimate than she had ever expected. It was a gesture so ordinary, and yet it felt like a small victory over the isolation that had defined her for so long. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let the moment linger, her fingers grazing his ever so gently. The days had blurred together. There were no longer clear divisions between work and rest, between time spent alone and time spent with Callan. It was as though the very air of the ship had begun to change, filled with the unspoken understanding that lingered between them. An understanding that neither had quite named, but that both felt pressing against their hearts like an inevitable force. Callan had become a constant in her life. He was no longer just a technician aboard her ship. He was someone who had slipped under her defenses without even trying. Lyra was keenly aware of how his presence had begun to shape her days, how the soft cadence of his voice seemed to resonate in the quiet spaces of her mind, long after he had left her side. He had a way of making the cold, sterile walls of the ship feel less oppressive, less lonely. And with each passing moment, the walls she had so carefully built around herself, walls made of years of solitude and old scars, began to crack. It wasn't love, not yet. Not the way Lyra had once imagined it to be. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping gestures of passion. It wasn't like the stories she had heard about human romance, the kind that burned with intensity. But this was something different, something quieter yet no less powerful. It was an unspoken bond that threaded through their every interaction, a bond that grew stronger with every moment they shared, even in silence. The complexity of their connection was always on the edge of her consciousness. Lyra couldn't help but wonder what Callan truly saw in her. Did he see her as a creature of grace, a being from the stars, or did he see her as what she truly was, flawed, broken, scarred by the weight of a history she could never erase? She didn't know. He hadn't asked for the details of her past. He didn't press her for the full story, and that, more than anything, was what set him apart from everyone else she had ever known. But there were moments that caught her off guard, when she would find herself staring at him, wondering how it was that someone so effortlessly kind, so genuinely patient, could continue to look at her without seeing the darkness that resided within. He never flinched when he looked at her. His eyes were always warm, as though he saw not just her but the person she could be, the person she wanted to be. One evening, as the ship glided through the empty expanse of space, Lyra found herself once again in the observation lounge. She had been spending more time there lately, drawn to the view of the stars. The black void of space had never felt so close, so full of possibility. She stood by the viewport, hands clasped behind her back, watching the stars drift by as if they were somehow beckoning her to follow them. It was here that Callan found her, standing silently, her eyes fixed on the infinite distance ahead. "How do you do it?" Callan's voice broke through the quiet like a gentle breeze, warm and reassuring. Lyra didn't turn to face him at first. She wasn't sure what she would say. "Do what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, lost in the vastness of the moment. "Live with so much silence." His words were measured, as though he had thought long and hard about them. It must be difficult, living in this silence, knowing that everything around you is empty. For a moment, there was only the sound of the ship's hum and the distant echo of his words as they hung in the air. Lyra swallowed, her throat suddenly tight. She had always been the one to hide behind her silence, to shield herself from the world outside. The silence was a friend she had learned to rely on, even if it sometimes made her feel like she was suffocating. But the truth was, the silence was no longer enough. She wasn't sure when it had changed, when her heart had started to ache with a quiet desperation. The silence that once protected her had begun to feel like a cage. "I don't know," she said softly, turning to face him at last. "I've lived in silence so long. I forgot what it was like to hear someone else, to feel something again." Callan's gaze softened as he stepped closer, his hands in his pockets, his posture open and unguarded. "Then maybe it's time to stop hiding behind it." Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. His words were simple, but they carried an undeniable weight, one that sank into her like a stone dropping into still water. She could feel the tension building between them, a quiet pressure that made it hard to breathe. It wasn't just the words that affected her. It was the way he looked at her, the depth in his eyes, as though he were searching for something buried deep inside her, something she had hidden even from herself. For a moment, she didn't speak. She simply watched him, feeling the space between them narrow with each passing second. She wasn't used to being seen like this, not with such tenderness, such intent. She took a step closer to him, instinctively. Her breath caught when she realized just how close they were now, how small the space between them had become. Callan's gaze never wavered. He didn't look away, didn't back down. It was as if he was daring her to let go of the walls she had built, daring her to trust him. Her mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. It would be so easy to close herself off again, to retreat into the safety of silence. But the part of her that had been so cold for so long, the part of her that had buried everything, including her own desires, yearned to take a risk, to step forward, and so in a moment that felt both reckless and necessary, she reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and placed it gently on his arm. Callan's eyes flickered to her hand, then back to her face, his expression softening with something like relief. There was no hesitation in his movement when he placed his hand over hers. It was a simple touch, a quiet reassurance that seemed to carry all the unspoken emotions between them. She held his gaze, and for the first time in a long time she felt something other than loneliness. Something that began as a spark, but quickly bloomed into something far greater. "Callan," she whispered, her voice breaking through the years of silence. "I don't know if I'm ready for this, but I want to try. I want to see what happens, if we don't hide anymore." For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The universe held its breath. Then Callan nodded slowly, his hand giving hers a gentle squeeze. "We'll take it one step at a time. Together." Their bond deepened after that night. But as with all things that matter, there was a shadow hanging over them, something neither of them could escape. The outside world, the one beyond the ship, had a way of intruding, and sooner or later Lyra would have to face the consequences of the feelings she was beginning to allow herself to feel. The ship, which had once felt like a lifeless vessel, drifting through the endless dark, now seemed to pulse with the energy of their growing connection. Every day Lyra and Callan shared more, subtle exchanges of glances, quiet words, the simple comfort of being near each other. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was something that, for the first time in years, made Lyra feel like she could breathe again, like she could remember what it was to be human, even though her nature was so far from that of Callan. But the past, as it always does, cast its long shadow over them. Lyra hadn't spoken much about where she came from, about the species she once belonged to, or the mission that had brought her to this corner of the galaxy. The weight of that history was something she carried alone, a burden that had shaped everything she was. She had never told Callan about the otherworldly colonies she had once called home, the people she had known, and the choices that had brought her to this moment. She wasn't ready. But on one particular evening, the weight of the past grew too heavy to ignore. It was during their usual meal in the mess hall, the ship's fluorescent lights casting a soft glow over the small table. They had shared stories of their different worlds, light-hearted, fleeting exchanges, but this time, something was different. Something was in the air between them, something Lyra couldn't ignore. "Tell me about your world," Callan said, breaking the silence that had fallen over them. He was always curious, always asking, his interest genuine and kind. His eyes, never judged, never pried. He simply wanted to know. For a moment Lyra froze, her fork hovering mid-air. Her pulse quickened, her throat tightened. She hadn't realized how much she had kept locked inside her until now. She had managed to build a life without sharing her past, without allowing herself to confront the remnants of a people who had abandoned her. But now it seemed impossible to continue hiding. I don't talk about it much," Lyra said, her voice low, the words stumbling out as if they were foreign to her. She placed her fork down, her hands shaking ever so slightly. Callan noticed the shift in her demeanor instantly. "I understand," he said softly, sensing her unease. "But you don't have to hide it from me. I want to know the truth, Lyra. The whole truth." She closed her eyes for a brief moment, her chest tightening. Could she really tell him? Could she trust him with the broken pieces of her history? The silence between them stretched, filled with so many unsaid things. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, warm and patient, but there was something else in his eyes, an unspoken plea for her to open up. It was gentle, but insistent. "I'm not from here," she began, her voice shaky at first but growing steadier with each word. "I'm from a world far beyond this galaxy, a colony, once thriving with life, with culture, with everything that makes a species whole. But we failed." Her eyes flickered away from him. focusing on the empty space between them as if it could offer some comfort. My people. They were too focused on their own desires. They believed they were meant to dominate, to conquer the stars. They thought they were invincible. Callan said nothing, his eyes never leaving her, though his expression softened, as he sensed the weight of her words. I was part of an expedition, she continued, her voice barely a whisper now. We were sent out to explore, to make first contact with alien races. It was supposed to be peaceful, a diplomatic mission. But we didn't understand what we were walking into. We didn't understand how fragile our place in the universe really was. She paused, her mind spinning with memories that she had long since tried to bury. The faces of her fellow colonists, the panic as their world crumbled, the destructive decisions they made in their arrogance. The mission failed, she said finally. My people were wiped out by their own actions. I was the only one who survived. She swallowed hard, fighting the lump in her throat. I was cast adrift, alone, and ever since then I've been running from the people I once was, running from the history I left behind. The silence that followed was suffocating. Callan didn't speak. He didn't need to. Lyra had said more than she ever thought she could. The truth hung between them, heavy and raw. For a long time neither of them moved. Callan finally reached across the table, his hand gently brushing hers. The contact was quiet, simple, but it was enough. She looked up at him, her eyes full of pain, full of years of solitude. And there was something in his gaze, something deeper than sympathy. He didn't pity her, he simply saw her. I can't change your past, Lyra, Callan said, his voice steady but kind. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Whatever you've been running from, you don't have to face it alone anymore. His words pierced through the armor she had worn for so long. It was too much vulnerability, too much trust. She felt the dam inside her begin to crack. The silence between them was no longer cold. It was a space for healing, for acceptance. In the days that followed, something shifted. Lyra found herself growing closer to Callan in ways she hadn't expected. The bond they shared, once unspoken and uncertain, now felt stronger, more grounded. But the shadow of her past, her guilt, her responsibility, still lingered. There were moments when she would catch herself staring at him, wondering how he could look at her without seeing the darkness she carried. But every time she looked into his eyes, she was reminded of what he had said. You don't have to face it alone. For the first time, Lyra began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she could let go of the weight that had kept her chained for so long. If maybe, just maybe, there could be a future where she wasn't defined by the mistakes of her past. But she couldn't escape the growing feeling that, no matter how far she ran, the past would always find a way to catch up with her. As they navigated through the stars, Lyra's unease never truly dissipated. She could feel the looming shadow of her history, of the Galactic War, of her people's fall, always watching from the edges of her mind. And she knew that no matter how much she cared for Callan, the ghosts of her past might one day demand more from her than she was willing to give. Lyra stood at the observation window, her fingers tracing the cool surface of the glass as the stars stretched out before her. The vastness of space always had a way of putting things into perspective. It made her feel small, insignificant even, against the backdrop of the cosmos. Yet in this moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Callan was beside her, but his presence didn't weigh her down. It was a comfort, a steady anchor in the endless void of space. Over the past weeks, she had come to rely on him more than she ever thought possible. Not just for his warmth, his gentle understanding, but for the fact that he offered her a way out of the shadows. A way forward, even if she wasn't sure where it would lead. But she knew one thing. For certain, she couldn't run anymore. Her eyes flickered to Callan. He was looking at her, his expression a mixture of concern and something deeper, something that mirrored her own feelings, something she had never allowed herself to name. The silence between them had become a language of its own. It was filled with shared moments, with all the things they had left unsaid, with the bond they had formed, fragile yet unbreakable. Lyra. Callan's voice broke the silence, soft but deliberate, like a whisper that needed to be heard. "There's something you're not telling me." Her heart skipped a beat. The quiet in his voice, the weight of his words made her feel exposed, as though he had peeled back the layers she had fought so hard to keep hidden. "I've told you everything that matters," she replied, though her voice was shaky. She knew the words weren't true. She had told him about her past, about her people, but there was one thing she hadn't said, not to him, not to anyone. It was the thing that had always kept her locked away, the thing that haunted her like a spectre. Callan stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I know you've been carrying something, Lyra. Something you're afraid of, afraid to share. You don't have to face it alone." She swallowed hard, the weight of his words, the softness in his eyes. It made the walls she had so carefully built feel like they were crumbling. Slowly, she pulled away from the window and turned to face him. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to be vulnerable, to stand in the truth of her feelings. "There's a reason I can't stay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A reason why, no matter how much I want this, I can't let myself fully be with you." Callan frowned, confusion clouding his expression. "What do you mean? Why?" Lyra's breath hitched as she tried to steady herself. She could feel the familiar cold weight pressing against her chest, but she couldn't hold it back anymore. She had to say it. She had to let him understand the gravity of her words. "Callan," she began, her eyes meeting his with a sense of finality. "I'm not just an alien to you, I'm an alien to myself. What's left of my people, what remains of us, are scattered across the galaxy. I've spent years running from them, from everything that came before, but—" Her voice faltered, her body trembling slightly as the truth seeped through. "I know that I carry the burden of their actions, the mistakes they made, the wars they waged, and I'm afraid. I'm afraid that no matter how much I care for you, no matter how much I want to stay with you, I'm not the person you think I am." Callan's gaze softened, but there was no pity in it, only understanding. He took another step forward, closing the space between them, his presence overwhelming but grounding. The space between them was no longer a gulf, it was a bridge. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hand, his touch tender, and for the first time in a long time she allowed herself to lean into it. "I don't care about your past, Lyra," he whispered, his voice a calm anchor in the storm of her thoughts. "I care about who you are now, and I care about you, the person standing in front of me. I don't care about where you come from. I care about where we're going, together." Her eyes filled with tears at the simplicity of his words. He didn't need her to be perfect. He didn't need her to be someone she wasn't. He just needed her to be here, with him, as she was. And that, more than anything, was the thing that broke through her walls. "But the consequences of my people's actions," Lyra began, but her voice trailed off, the words unable to capture the depth of her fear. She was a survivor of destruction, of a species' greed, of an entire civilization that had unraveled because of its own hubris. How could she ever escape that? How could she ever allow herself to love again, to trust again, when all she knew was the pain of those who had fallen before her? Callan shook his head gently. "The past can't define us, Lyra. You've spent so long running, but you don't have to keep running anymore. You've built something new here, something good, and I'm not asking you to forget your past, but I am asking you to stop letting it control you. You have the choice to let go. You have the choice to start fresh." The words hung in the air between them, resonating deep within her. It was the choice that terrified her more than anything, to let go of the past, to forgive herself, to trust in the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by what had already been lost. And in that moment, Lyra made her choice. She took a deep breath, the weight in her chest easing slightly as she allowed herself to be vulnerable. Slowly, she reached for his hand, her fingers trembling but firm. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I'm scared of what it means to let go of everything I've known. But I'm not alone anymore, and maybe, that's enough to begin again." Callan's eyes softened and he pulled her into his arms. She let herself go. leaning into his embrace as if it were the first time she had allowed herself to be held in years. It wasn't a grand declaration of love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something new, a chance to heal, to build something, together, even when the road ahead was uncertain. For the first time, Lyra felt something she had forgotten was possible: hope. The stars outside seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, a silent witness to the choice she had just made. The vastness of the universe no longer felt like a void to be filled, but a canvas on which she and Callan could paint the next chapter of their lives. The future was unknown, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't matter. If this story moved you, share it with someone who loves powerful tales from distant worlds. Don't forget to like and let us know in the comments. What would you have done?